I'm gonna be honest with you, aquascaping is not one of my most favorite parts of this hobby, primarily because I'm not the best at it and I like to be the best at things, but over the past decade, I have picked up all sorts of tips and tricks that I wanna share with you. As always, a big thanks to our sponsor, Coral Vault. You know, it's always really important not only that things are shipped well, but that you get a good quality product. So let me show you something real quick. Come here. For anybody who's been following me for a while, you know I'm terrible with anemones, and part of the reason is getting bad product. But you see this anemone? The one that all of these high-end clownfish love? This was purchased from Coral Vault. I will say that not only have their items been shipped well to me, but they have been a high-quality product. So if you're interested in buying high-quality products, which I'm sure you are, not only are items shipped well, but every item I've received has been incredibly high quality. So check them out, coral-vault.com. Hey everybody, Matthew here from My First Fish Tank in collaboration with Marine Depot, and this episode in week 13, we bring you how to aquascape. Just in case you missed last week's video where we talk all about reef rock, we'll put a link up here and in the description below. And of course, all of the reef rock as well as the tools and the gear we're going to use in today's video can be found at Marine Depot. Just click on the link below. Before we even dive into how to go about aquascaping, I think it's really important to do your research. I know I hound this over and over again, but research is the most important thing when starting to build an aquascape. And really, for doing research on how to aquascape, I'm talking about how to become inspired. There are some great aquascapers out there, and if you're a newbie or a seasoned professional, it will do a lot of good to go to Instagram, to go to YouTube, but really Instagram is perfect for this, and research by looking at different aquascapes out there. You will get a ton of good ideas and seascapes that make sense and that will give you a vision of where you want to go. Let me just make a few recommendations for some Instagrammers who are really good at aquascaping and some feeds that you could check out. First of all, make sure you check out Marine Depot because they post a lot of content from all sorts of Instagrammers. So if you scroll through their feed, you're gonna find a lot of amazing looking aquascapes. You can also go to My First Fish Tank, which is obviously my feed. I'm not the best aquascaper, but I have done several posts in the past on Instagram that will show you my process and show you some of the aquascapes I've created. Another one of my favorites is her Nano Reefs. She is an anemone expert, but she also does amazing mixed reef tanks, and she just completed a brand new aquascape that is stunning to look at. So check her out, her Nano Reefs. If you want some inspiration for some macroalgae planted tanks, if that's the direction you're gonna go, check out Inland Reef. He's St. Louis based and has this beautiful long peninsula tank that he has scaped very minimally, but that works really well with macroalgae. Another good macroalgae scape option to help inspire you is Taiga Boy H2O. He is an artist. I kid you not. Check out his work. He does very, very small tanks that look like these amazing biotopes and forest biospheres. They're absolutely gorgeous. So check him out. It's Taiga Boy H2O. And the last recommendation I would make is CJ's Aquariums. He hasn't been active for a little while, but he just has a gift for making these aquascapes that are not only good for fish and for livestock, but really good for putting different corals. So check him out, CJ's Aquariums. I think there are 7 things to consider before building your aquascape. The first is what I recommend over and over again. What is your end goal? Because knowing your end goal will shape what you want your aquascape to look like. If you know you're going to go with a seahorse tank over here, then you're going to want to build a more minimal aquascape with some large branching pieces for a seahorse to wrap its tail around. If you're going to go with a high-end SPS, a small polyp stony tank, then you're going to want to make sure you build your aquascape maybe a little bit higher and leave a lot of room around it for good flow and a lot of par. If you want to go with a mixed reef tank, then you're going to need to make sure you have all sorts of different levels in your tank for some low light corals and for some high light corals. And if you want to go for something like a fish-only system, well, you're going to scape it completely differently. So knowing what your end goal is going to be is going to help dictate what kind of scape you're going to build. The second factor to consider is the flow pattern. Now, this is really challenging as a beginner because you won't have a good understanding of flow in your tank. But really what you're going for is to make sure there are no dead spots in your tank. Because if there are dead spots in your tank, you will find that detritus, fish fish waste, fish food will build up there over time. Some easy ways to avoid any sort of dead spots is just to make sure when you're building your scape that you leave space around all four sides so that you can place wave makers or power heads at various locations to make sure you keep that detritus suspended. Not only that, when you're considering flow patterns in your tank, it's important to know if you want an LPS tank, a softy tank, or an SPS dominated tank, because they're all going to require different amounts of flow. The safest thing to do is to create an aquascape that not only has space all the way around it, but that has different areas in the scape itself that will reach higher flow and that will be lower flow. That way you know you have a scape going forward that can accommodate some LPS, some softies, and some higher flow SPS corals. The third consideration is par and shadowing. One thing you definitely don't want to do is create an aquascape that blocks out the light. If you were to put some sort of flat piece near the top of your scape and you had a puck style light, it would just cast shadows and basically reduce the light in the entire tank. So when you're doing your aquascape, think about the par levels in your tank and where you place the pieces. Be sure not to place big clunky pieces near the top because they will cast shadows, but also think about what kind of corals you're going to want. Because if you're doing a mixed reef system, which I would say the majority of people are going to do, you're going to want to put some rocks near the top and some near the bottom so that you have places with a lot of par and places with a lower amount of par spread throughout your tank. The fourth consideration is empty spaces and islands. It can be tempting to just fill your tank with rock, but while having a solid aquascape with a lot of places to mount corals and hiding places for your fish is really important, it's equally important to have empty spaces. Not only does empty space give a better aesthetic appeal and more depth, empty spaces in your tank also are a great place to place zoa islands or GSP gardens. Not only that, but it's also a good place for certain sorts of corals that like to live on the sand bed. So just take into consideration when building your aquascape not to scape every single inch, but to allow some vacant spaces for future growth. The fifth thing to consider is the height of your aquascape. While it may be tempting to build your aquascape all the way to the top, and for some people that works really well, if you want to put corals on the top of your rockwork, probably the highest you're going to want to scape is about 2/3 of the way up. That'll give you space to place corals on top of the aquascape and allow space on the top for flow to kind of circulate in your tank. Now, if you have something very specific in mind, a mangrove system, or you just know that you want to plant some plants outside of it, I have seen people build amazing aquascapes that actually take the aquascape above the water line. Those are usually more specialty tanks, and I wouldn't recommend that for beginner unless you have something really specific in mind. The sixth consideration is hiding spaces for fish. Now, if you're just going to stack a lot of rocks in there, it's going to naturally have a whole bunch of hiding spots and caves. But if you're going to go with some sort of more minimalistic approach to your aquascaping, it can be challenging to build in hiding places, and it's going to limit what types of fish you can get, because there are so many species of fish that need not only a place to hide to feel safe, but a place to sleep at night. So consider that when building your aquascape and make sure you build in places for certain species of fish to hide and to live. And the seventh factor to consider, which we've already touched on, is coral placement. If you're doing a fish-only system, this doesn't matter, but I'd say most of you watching this are going to add some sort of corals and anemones. So when you're doing it, don't think of the aquascape as the end goal. The end goal is the corals on the aquascape. And really, at the end of the day, if you do a good job aquascaping and you add corals, eventually you're not even going to see the aquascape anymore because it's going to be covered in corals. So try to envision the aquascape as merely a base for your corals and see what that will look like in the future. Let's talk a little bit about the rule of thirds. I find the rule of thirds to be really helpful when composing an aquascape. Now, not everybody subscribes to the rule of thirds, but I certainly do. The rule of thirds basically says this: you take any sort of image and you draw two equally spaced horizontal lines and two equally spaced vertical lines. Then when composing your image, you place the subject at the intersections of those lines instead of in the middle. The theory being that a subject placed at the intersection of those thirds is just so much more visually exciting, and there's more tension, and there's more space, and there's more depth. So what I like to do when I'm building my aquascapes is I will oftentimes draw in with a pen or use tape those two vertical lines and those two horizontal lines, and I will try to build the key places of my aquascape at the intersections of those lines. You don't have to do that, obviously, but if you look at a lot of images on Instagram and a lot of videos of how to aquascape, they're going to talk about the rule of thirds, and visually speaking, I think the rule of thirds makes a lot of sense. Just check out a couple of these images. Here's an example of the subject right in the center, and an example of the subject at the intersection of the lines. To me, there's a huge difference, and my eye is so much more drawn not only to the subject, but then to the big empty space. Let's talk aquascaping tools. Now, if you just go with a really simple aquascape where you stack stuff on, you're not gonna need any of these tools. And honestly, it might be easier as a beginner to really minimize the use of tools. But let's talk about the tools that you may use. First up is a saw. A saw or even a sawzall can be really good for cutting off portions, especially for base rock, to create a more flat surface or to create stability. Now, saw marks generally on rock don't look very good, so I pretty much only use a saw if there's a small section that I need to chip off to make the aquascape more stable. Then you have a chisel. A chisel is super handy if you're trying to connect pieces together, but there's just one extruding part of reef rock that just doesn't make it work. You can grab your chisel, chisel it off, and then put the pieces together. But beware when using the chisel, because especially with human-made rock, it can crumble very quickly. And when you're chiseling, you might just think, I just need one more little hammer and one more little spot, and then the piece just crumbles. Then you have your super glue, your epoxy, and your cement. Super glue I find really helpful for very, very small jobs. I use super glue for things like after creating my scape. If there's a really ugly cement line, I'll take a piece of rubble rock or a whole bunch of pieces of rubble rock and super glue them onto that seam to kind of hide it. Now with cement, I like to use cement when I'm trying to hold together larger pieces because I don't want to use an entire thing of epoxy to secure those. Cement is a lot cheaper. So I'll go ahead and mix up some cement and then put those bigger pieces together. I do like using epoxy sometimes as well for smaller pieces or for areas that are just more visually available, because cement can be very ugly, but if you get a core line color epoxy, it can really help hide those seams. Overall, there are two methods of aquascaping. The first is secured, the second is unsecured. An unsecured aquascape is just stacking rocks together. Sometimes this works really well, sometimes it doesn't. The problem with stacking rocks together is there are certain critters, snails, conches, all sorts of things that are more powerful than you think, that if pieces aren't secured together well, they can knock them over and causing your aquascape to tumble. You can do an unsecured aquascape if you're doing something simple, like in my clownfish harem tank, where I'm just stacking a whole bunch of pieces together. But even though I didn't secure this at first, there were a couple tippy pieces that I had to go back in later and add some epoxy to. The pros of an unsecured aquascape is it's super easy and it limits your options, so it's very, very simple. But the downsides can be that it can make your aquascape tumble, possibly breaking your glass or killing some livestock. Well, let's jump right into how to aquascape. There are an infinite number of ways you could go about doing an aquascape, but this is the method that I have used that has seemed to work really well. If you have a different method or you have a good video that you could share, put a comment down below so that other people can watch that to get other ideas. The first step is to build a cardboard mock-up. What I do is I measure the tank. I measure the width, the height, and the depth, and then I go and I get two large pieces of cardboard and I set them up. Using a pen or using tape, I mark the outlines of both the base and the height, and I place this cardboard mock-up on the ground. Why do I do this? Because I don't like building my aquascape in the tank itself. One, it's a huge pain to have to constantly reach your hands into the tank, and two, accidents happen. And if you drop a piece of rock, you can shatter or crack the bottom of the tank, thus destroying the whole tank. Not only that, but there's more risk of chipping the top or scratching the glass. So I always use a cardboard mock-up, and a cardboard mock-up can be great because you can also draw in the rule of thirds lines so that you can really have a good visual representation. Then I like to get some sort of old blanket and I lay it out, and I go and I get all of my reef rock and I lay it out. It's not really useful if you just leave your reef rock in a box. You need to be able to see the rock and the shapes, and you need it to be able to be easily accessible. But make sure you put a blanket down or a large cardboard down, or do this outside, because this reef rock, trust me, I've done this, will scratch up any sort of wooden surface. Then you're gonna gather your tools. Gather your Sawzall, gather your saw, gather your chisel, your hammer, your glue, everything you think you might need. Even if you don't use it, it's so much easier to just lay it all out and have everything at your disposal as you're going through the aquascaping process. All right, now it's time to be like a Van Gogh. Step back, look at all of your rocks, try to pull out a few pieces that are unique, and develop an overall vision of what you think it's gonna look like. I like to find the most interesting and unique pieces that were sent to me and use those as the foundational elements in my aquascape. This can be a lot easier if you purchase some sort of human-made reef rock that comes in unique shapes. If you just have a whole bunch of clunky base rock shapes, then oftentimes you need to chisel them apart to create some sort of interesting shape. But if you get something like life rock shapes or cornerstone reef rock, it will already come in unique shapes, so it makes your aquascaping job a lot easier. Now you just gotta start stacking pieces together. Take your time with this, try different angles, different things, and then once you have some sort of piece together, some sort of structure, step back from it and look at it from all angles, from each side of your tank, but especially looking at it from the angle that you think you're gonna stare at it the most. Because while it may look really good from a side angle, maybe from the front, it just doesn't make as much sense. You're gonna do this over and over again during your aquascape, but it's really important once you think you have something that looks cool to step back and look at it from all angles. By the way, I totally forgot to mention, this is a unique aquascape for me today that I'm making because this is specifically made for the seahorse tank. So I'm not planning on placing any corals in it. I'm really trying to do a more minimal scape for macroalgae and a place for seahorses to wrap their tails around. For the foundation pieces of my aquascape, I like to either choose slightly arched pieces, or if I'm using a flat piece, what I'll do is I will often glue or epoxy 3 small feet to it, because it's not a great idea to just place a flat rock on the bottom, because 1, there's not a lot of space underneath that rock for critters to live, and 2, you can have a lot of detritus buildup. So I like trying to lift up either with an arch or with feet those foundation pieces for my aquascape. Once you like your aquascape and you think it looks good, step back from it, go have lunch, like I said, be patient, and come back and look at it in an hour or 2 hours. If you notice anything you don't like or anything you want to do differently, now is the time to do that. Because once you start cementing and once you start epoxying or gluing, it's hard to go back. Another thing you're going to come across, especially if you buy human-made rock, it always breaks in shipping. I mean, they try their best, but I have never received a shipment where the arch is together. I mean, this last shipment I got, I think half of the arches were together and half were broken. It's really not a big deal. I know it frustrates some people, but all you have to do is just get out some glue, get out some epoxy, get out some cement, and you can just put them together and glue them into place. Now it's time to cement or epoxy them together. Like I said before, I use a mix of things. For bigger pieces, I use cement. There are various kinds of cement out there. This one I'm using from Aquaforest Stonefix is kind of hard to find. You can purchase a Nios cement. I know Marco Rocks makes their own. The kind that I'm using is great because it comes dry and then you just mix in a little bit of water. If you're going to use this method, then make sure you use gloves, a plastic cup, and plastic utensils. This cement, it goes from runny to hard in an instant. So you want to make really small batches and use it quickly. If possible, it's awesome if you can hide the seams. But sometimes you just can't do it. Sometimes you need to place cement around the outside. that's not a big deal because you can take pieces of rubble rock later and either epoxy them on or glue them on, and you won't even be able to see the seam. Once it hardens into place, it's not indestructible. It's still going to be really weak at that point, so you're going to need to be really careful when you pick this up and move this into the tank. One thing I like to do when using this cement is before the cement dries, I take a piece of rubble rock, a very jagged piece of rubble rock, and I will try to make indentations all around that seam. It gives it a more roughed up look that not only visually looks a little better, but I think it helps to attach future rubble rock to hide that seam. While I do like using the cement for larger pieces, for smaller pieces, I like this purple coral line epoxy so much better. It's easy to mix up, it smells kind of bad, but the color really helps hide that seam. But here it's really important, even more important than with the cement, that before that epoxy dries, to take that piece of rubble rock and press it into the seams, because when you have a really jagged rock and then all of a sudden you have this smooth space, it's really easy to notice a seam. But if you're able to kind of rough up that epoxy, it really helps hide those seams. But again, if it still looks bad, even after it's dry, you can either place corals on that, or you can go ahead and glue or epoxy some pieces of a rubble rock to it to completely hide the seam. Be sure you follow the manufacturer recommendations. I usually like to wait about 24 hours to allow these pieces to dry. And honestly, if I'm doing a larger aquascape, I don't like to cement all of the pieces together because then you have to move all of those pieces together and it might be too heavy. So when I'm doing an aquascape, I like to aquascape in smaller chunks, knowing that after I move those chunks, I can slide the pieces together and they look like they're together from the beginning. Now it's time to move the scape into the tank. You're probably going to want a helper on this unless you have a smaller tank. You have to be really, really careful here because if you drop this rock aquascape onto the glass base, it's going to break it and you're going to have to get a whole new tank. And that is a huge nightmare. Also, I really recommend putting in your aquascape before adding your sand because you don't want your aquascape sitting on top of your sand because there are all sorts of critters and sand sifters that will over time eat away at that foundation and make your aquascape tilt, and it may tilt just enough that it topples the aquascape. So make sure that you place the aquascape securely on the glass floor and then add your sand after that. My last recommendation, I promise. Well, that's it. That was the entire introduction on how to aquascape. I'm sure I missed a few things, but if you found that helpful, please consider subscribing to Marine Depot and My First Fish Tank, giving this video a thumbs up, and be sure to tune in next week, week 14, where we discuss all things sand. As always, thanks for watching, everybody. Happy reefing. We'll see you next week. Be well.